The moment the stagecoach wheels stopped turning in the red dust of Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1878, Eleanor Voss pressed her gloved hand flat against the window glass and told herself that the ache in her chest would eventually stop, the way a bell eventually stops ringing after someone strikes it hard enough to make the whole church tremble. She had been on the road for 11 days, riding west from Cincinnati with a carpet bag, a hat box, and a grief so heavy it had kept her from eating more than a few bites at every meal stop along the way. The other passengers on the final leg from Wichita had noticed, though none of them had said a word. A traveling salesman with wax in his mustache had offered her a peppermint stick somewhere around the middle of the Kansas plain, and she had accepted it with a thin smile that she knew did not reach her eyes. He had looked away quickly after that, which was precisely what she had wanted. The grief had a name, and the name was Charles Aldrich. Charles, with his careful suits and his careful words and his careful promises, each one delivered in the parlor of her father's house in Cincinnati, as though he were reading from a legal document rather than courting a woman he claimed to love. They had been engaged for 8 months. The wedding had been set for June 14th. On June 9th, Eleanor had walked into her father's study to find Charles seated across the desk from her father, signing papers that transferred a significant portion of the Voss family shipping contracts to the Aldrich mercantile firm. He had looked up at her with an expression that was not embarrassment but something colder than that, something closer to relief, as though her arrival at precisely that moment had saved him the trouble of a longer performance. He had not loved her. He had loved the contracts. The engagement had been a business arrangement dressed in roses and Sunday afternoon walks, and Eleanor had been the only person in the city of Cincinnati who had not understood that from the beginning. Her mother had understood. Her father had understood. Even her closest friend, Harriet, had gently tried to warn her once, using the careful language of someone who knows that the truth will hurt regardless of how it is wrapped. Eleanor had refused to hear it. She had been 24 years old, and she had wanted very much to believe that Charles Aldrich looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he cannot imagine living without. She had been wrong, and the wrongness of it had settled inside her like a cold stone she could not dislodge. Her father had suggested the journey west as a remedy, the way Victorian men of means suggested most inconvenient things, quietly, firmly, and with the clear understanding that the inconvenient thing would be taken care of and not spoken of afterward. Her mother's sister, a woman named Dorothea Prewitt, had been living in Caldwell for 3 years, having followed her own husband there when he had taken up land surveying for the railroad. The arrangement was simple. Eleanor would spend 6 months with Aunt Dorothea, recover herself, and return to Cincinnati in the spring ready to be sensible. Eleanor had agreed because she had not had the energy to disagree, and because some small part of her did genuinely want to put as many miles between herself and Charles Aldrich as the continent would allow. What she had not expected, stepping down from the stagecoach onto the packed earth of Caldwell's Main Street, with dust on her skirts and tears she refused to shed still burning behind her eyes, was the cowboy. He was standing at the far end of the street when she first noticed him, tall and unhurried, with a bay horse tied to the post outside the general store, and a battered hat pushed back on his head the way a man pushes his hat back when he is thinking hard about something. He was not especially handsome in the way that Charles Aldrich had been handsome, which was to say he was not polished or arranged or carefully presented. He was simply there, the way a fence post is there, or the way the horizon is there, solid and certain and not asking anyone's opinion about it. She would not have given him a second thought except that at precisely the moment her heel caught the gap between the coach step and the ground, and she pitched forward with a small, undignified cry, he was the one who moved. He moved fast, crossing the distance between them with long, easy strides, and his hand caught her elbow before she had fully registered that she was falling. She found herself upright, her hat tilted sideways, her dignity somewhat scattered in the dust, staring at a sunburned jaw and a pair of the most direct gray eyes she had ever encountered. "Easy now," he said. "The ground out here is not forgiving." It was not a remarkable thing to say. It was, in fact, a perfectly ordinary thing to say. But his voice was quiet and unhurried and carried no performance in it whatsoever, and Eleanor, who had spent 8 months listening to a man whose every syllable was calculated for effect, felt something shift slightly in the region of that cold stone in her chest. "Thank you," she said, pulling her elbow back and straightening her hat with what she hoped was composure. "I am quite all right." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he sounded as though he believed her, which was more than most people had managed in the past 2 weeks. He touched the brim of his hat and stepped back, and that was all. He did not linger or introduce himself or look at her with any of the particular interest that she was accustomed to generating and had recently learned to distrust. He simply went back to his horse, checked the saddlebag, untied the reins, and rode away down the street at an easy walk, raising a small cloud of red dust that settled slowly in the summer heat. Eleanor stood on the boardwalk watching him go, and she thought, for the first time in many days, about something other than Charles Aldridge. Aunt Dorothea arrived in a buckboard wagon 20 minutes later, apologizing breathlessly for the delay and pressing Eleanor's cheeks between both her hands with the forthright affection of a woman who had spent 3 years in Kansas and forgotten entirely how to be restrained about such things. She was a compact, energetic woman of 51 with iron-gray hair and a laugh that came easily and often, and Eleanor, who had been expecting to feel nothing in particular, was startled to find herself genuinely glad to see her. "You look thin," Dorothea announced, loading the carpet bag into the wagon herself before Eleanor could reach for it. "You also look like a person who has been crying on the inside for a very long time, which is harder on a body than crying on the outside. We will fix that. Are you hungry? I made a prairie chicken pie." "I am hungry," Eleanor admitted, and discovered it was true. Dorothea's house was 3 miles outside of town, a proper frame house that her husband Gerald had built with actual windows and a wood stove that heated both the kitchen and the parlor when the wind was right. Gerald Pruitt was a quiet, round-faced man who shook Eleanor's hand at the door and immediately began talking about the railroad survey in a way that made it clear he was nervous around visitors and relieved when Dorothea redirected him toward the stove. The house smelled of beeswax and wood smoke and the particular dry sweetness of Kansas summer, and Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and ate 2 servings of prairie chicken pie and a piece of cornbread. And when Dorothea set a cup of coffee in front of her, she wrapped both hands around it and felt, cautiously, as though she might eventually be capable of being a person again. "Tell me about Caldwell," she said, because she needed to talk about something that was not Cincinnati. Dorothea settled across the table with her own coffee and the practical manner of a woman who understood exactly what was being asked. "It is a cattle town," she said. "Has been since the Kishom Trail made it the end of the line for the Texas cattle drives. The drovers come up through the summer, spend their wages, make a great deal of noise, and go back south before the cold sets in. The permanent residents are a mixed lot. Farmers, merchants, a few families who came for the land. There is a sheriff who is competent and a newspaper that is not. The school has 22 children and 1 teacher who is doing her valiant best. The church has a good preacher and a bad organ. On the whole, it is a real place with real people, which is what I expect you need." "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "I think it is." She slept 12 hours that first night, the sound of the Kansas wind against the window glass and the total darkness of the prairie outside making something in her nervous system finally surrender. When she woke, the sun was already high, and Dorothea had left a note on the kitchen table saying she had gone to town for flour, and that there were eggs in the basket, and a horse in the paddock that was gentle enough for a beginning rider if Eleanor felt like the exercise. Eleanor had never particularly ridden for pleasure. In Cincinnati, One rode in carriages. But she looked out the kitchen window at the horse, a small gray mare with an expression of mild philosophical resignation, and thought that perhaps this was as good a time as any to learn things differently. She scrambled 2 eggs, ate them standing at the stove, and went out to introduce herself to the mare. The mare's name, according to the note Dorothea had pinned to the paddock fence, was Agnes. Agnes regarded Eleanor with the same mild philosophical resignation. She appeared to apply to all aspects of her existence, and stood quietly while Eleanor attempted to remember everything she had ever observed about saddling a horse, which was not much. She got the blanket on correctly. The saddle gave her some trouble. She was wrestling with the cinch strap, her hat knocked sideways and her patience wearing thin, when she heard hoofbeats on the lane and looked up to find the gray-eyed cowboy from the day before riding toward her on the bay horse. He pulled up at the paddock fence and looked at the situation with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned that pointing out a person's difficulty too directly is not always appreciated. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Eleanor said, not releasing the cinch strap, because she was not going to be defeated by a piece of leather in front of a stranger. He was quiet for a moment. "The buckle end wants to go through the ring from the bottom up," he said, in the same tone of voice a person might use to remark upon the weather. Eleanor looked at the buckle. She looked at the ring. She turned the strap, pushed it through from the bottom, and the whole arrangement came together with a satisfying firmness that made her feel unreasonably accomplished. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "I am Colt Reardon," he said, swinging down from the bay with the easy, unconscious grace of a man who had been doing it his whole life. "I ride for Gerald Pruitt. I was meant to come by yesterday, but the trail count ran long." "Eleanor Voss," she said, pulling her hat back straight. "Dorothea's niece." "From Cincinnati." "I know," he said. "Dorothea has mentioned you were coming. She asked me to show you around the property this morning if you were willing, since she had business in town." Eleanor studied him with the careful attention she had learned to apply to people, since Cincinnati had taught her that she was not naturally very good at seeing them clearly. He was not young in the way that Charles had been young, which was to say that his face had lived in it. He appeared to be somewhere in his early 30s, with sun lines at the corners of those gray eyes and a quality of stillness that was not absence of feeling, but rather the presence of something well-governed. He held his hat in his hand while he waited for her answer, which was a courtesy she noticed. "I would appreciate that," she said. Colt Reardon had been riding for Gerald Pruitt for 2 years, which was the longest he had stayed anywhere in a decade. Before that, he had done ranch work in Texas, drove cattle up the Kishom Trail 3 times, spent a season in Colorado chasing a mining claim that came to nothing, and generally lived the kind of life that moved forward by its own momentum without any particular destination. He was 31 years old, unmarried, and had grown so accustomed to his own company that he had almost stopped noticing the lack of other company, which he privately suspected was not the healthiest development but which he had never quite gotten around to addressing. He showed Eleanor the property with the thoroughness of a man who took his responsibilities seriously, and the quiet of a man who did not feel the need to fill silence with performance. The Pruitt land ran to 320 acres, with a creek that held good water through the summer, and a grass meadow that Gerald had been slowly turning to hay crops to sell to the cattle drovers who came up from Texas each season. There were 6 horses, 20 cattle, a pig named General Sherman whom Colt appeared to regard with genuine personal affection, and a kitchen garden that Dorothea maintained with the focused determination of a woman who had decided that fresh vegetables were non-negotiable regardless of what the frontier thought about it. Eleanor walked beside him through the hay meadow, her city shoes unsuitable for the terrain and her skirts picking up seeds from the tall grass, and she asked him questions, because questions were easier than silence and silence left too much room for the cold stone to press against her ribs. She asked him how the hay was cut and baled, and he explained it. She asked him about the creek and whether it flooded in spring, and he told her it did mildly, and described the way the water rose and receded. She asked him about the cattle, and he told her their names, which she had not expected, and the information delighted her in a way she could not have explained. "You named them," she said. "Gerald names them," Colt said, and there was something in the slight change of his expression that she thought might be a suppressed smile. "I have advised him that naming cattle is not advisable if you also intend to sell them, but Gerald is a man of strong feeling where animals are concerned." "And you are not?" she asked. He considered this with an honesty she found refreshing. "I am," he said. "I simply do not name them." "But you named the pig." "General Sherman named himself," Colt said. "He has a quality that makes the name feel inevitable." Eleanor laughed. It came out before she had decided to do it, a real laugh, not the careful social laugh she had been deploying for months in Cincinnati drawing rooms. It surprised her. It appeared to surprise Colt as well, who looked at her with those direct gray eyes as though she had done something notable. "I am sorry," she said, pressing her fingers briefly to her lips. "I did not mean, do not apologize for laughing," he said quietly. "There is not nearly enough of it out here." They stood in the middle of the hay meadow with the Kansas sky enormous above them and the wind coming steadily from the south, and Eleanor thought that perhaps the bell was beginning to slow, infinitesimally, its ringing. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that Eleanor had not anticipated and that she found herself, against her expectations, needing. She rose early because the prairie made sleeping late feel somehow wasteful, the light coming up so fast and so completely across that unobstructed sky that remaining in bed past sunrise felt like missing something irreplaceable. She helped Dorothea with the kitchen garden, learning which plants were which and how to tell when things were ready to harvest, getting dirt on her hands in a way she had never gotten dirt on her hands in Cincinnati, and finding that she did not mind it. She rode Agnes in the afternoons, learning the horse's particular language by trial and error, and accumulating small competencies that added up slowly to something resembling confidence. Colt came to the property 4 days out of 7, and on those 4 days he and Eleanor existed in the same space in the way that two people who are both accustomed to minding their own business exist in the same space, companionably, without pressure, with a growing awareness of each other that neither of them was ready to acknowledge. He taught her things without making her feel taught, which was a skill she came to understand was genuinely rare. He showed her how to read the sky for weather, how to clean and oil a saddle properly, how to move around Agnes without spooking her, how to build a fire that would stay lit in the Kansas wind. She accepted each piece of knowledge with genuine attention, because she found that she was genuinely interested, which surprised her, because she had spent 8 months in Cincinnati being interested only in Charles Aldridge, and had not realized until now how much of herself she had quietly put away in service of that interest. One evening in late July, sitting on the porch steps after supper while Dorothea and Gerald played cards inside, the air cooling slowly from the brutal heat of the day, Eleanor asked Colt what had brought him to Kansas. It was the first time she had asked him anything personal, and she was aware of the shift in the question even as she asked it, the way it moved from the practical territory they had been inhabiting into something more exposed. He turned his hat slowly in his hands, looking out at the darkening plain. "Work," he said first, which she understood was the automatic answer. Then, after a moment, as though he were deciding something, "My father had a ranch in Texas. I grew up on it. He died when I was 19, and the bank took most of what was left because he had borrowed against it for a drought year, and the rains did not come. I could not buy it back. I tried for 3 years and could not get the money together in time. After that I just kept moving." "I am sorry," Eleanor said, "about your father and about the ranch." "It was a long time ago," he said, which was true in the way that time makes things true, which is not the same as resolved. "Do you wish you had stayed in Texas?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I did for a long time. I do not as much now." She did not ask him why, because she was afraid the answer would mean something she was not yet sure she knew how to manage. But she was aware, sitting there on the porch steps with the first stars coming out over the Kansas plain and the faint sound of Dorothea laughing at something inside, that the cold stone in her chest had become perceptibly smaller than it had been when she stepped off the stagecoach. She told him about Charles on a Tuesday morning in August, not because she had planned to, but because she dropped the saddle bag she had been carrying, and the latch came open and her letters spilled across the stable floor. And one of them, the last one Charles had sent with his formal and bloodless apology, landed face up with his name visible on the return address, and Colt picked it up without reading it and handed it back to her with an expression that asked nothing. And because he asked nothing, she found herself, inexplicably, telling him everything. She told it plainly, and without the careful softening she had been applying to the story when she told it to herself, which meant she told it with the full measure of humiliation and grief still attached. She told him about the contracts and about her father's study, and about the way Charles had looked at her with that cold relief. She told him about the 8 months of carefully calculated courtship, and about how stupid she felt for not having seen it clearly. And her voice stayed even through most of it until the part about the walk she and Charles had taken in the spring, when the cherry trees along the avenue were in bloom and he had held her hand and looked at her with an expression she had taken for love, and which she now understood had been something very much like appraisal. Her voice broke slightly on that part, just slightly, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the stable wall and waited for it to pass. Colt did not say that Charles Aldridge was a fool, though she could see the thought move briefly across his face. He did not offer the several varieties of comfortable reassurance she had been receiving from well-meaning people for 2 months. He said, quietly and with the particular seriousness of a man who means exactly what he says, "You deserved better than that. Not because of your family or your position or any of that, just because you did." Eleanor looked at him. The stable was warm and smelled of hay and horse, and the particular dusty sweetness of a Kansas August. His gray eyes were steady and direct, and entirely without calculation. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words carried more weight than they had on the day he had caught her elbow outside the stagecoach. He nodded once and picked up the saddle he had been intending to repair before her letters had scattered across the floor, and they worked alongside each other in the quiet stable for the next hour, and the silence between them was the most comfortable silence Eleanor had experienced in longer than she could clearly remember. August became a month of small discoveries. Eleanor found that she had opinions about the Kansas landscape, which had at first appeared to her to be simply flat and featureless, and entirely lacking in the scenic merits of the Ohio River Valley, but which revealed itself gradually to be full of a different kind of beauty. The way the light changed across the grass at different hours, the particular gold of the late afternoon when the whole plain seemed to be holding its breath before sunset, the improbable riot of wildflowers in the low ground near the creek, the absolute architecture of a thunderstorm building on the western horizon. She began keeping a small journal, writing down what she saw with a precision she had not previously applied to natural observation, and found that the act of close looking was a remedy in itself. She found that she was becoming friends with Colt Reardon, which was a thing she had not expected, and which was different from anything she had previously understood friendship between a man and a woman to be. It was not the performed interest of courtship. It was not the comfortable familiarity of siblings. It was something that had its own shape, a particular quality of ease and honesty and mutual attention that she noticed most clearly by its contrast to everything she had known with Charles, where every conversation had been, she now realized, a kind of negotiation. With Colt she said what she thought. She said that she found the smell of the feedlot unacceptable, and he laughed. She said that she believed the preacher at the Caldwell church was considerably better at dramatics than at theology, and he agreed with a succinctness that made her laugh in return. She said that she was frightened about going back to Cincinnati in the spring, and did not know how to be the person her family expected her to be anymore. And he listened to all of it without trying to solve it, which was precisely what she needed. On a Saturday in late August, Colt drove Eleanor and Dorothea into Caldwell in Gerald's wagon for the monthly market day, and Eleanor saw the town properly for the first time. Caldwell in 1878 was a town that lived in two registers simultaneously: the ordinary daily life of families and merchants and farmers, and the periodic disruption of the cattle trail season, when the Texas drovers came through, and the saloons ran hot, and the sheriff worked long hours keeping the peace. On market day the first register dominated, the street lined with wagons and the boardwalks busy with women examining bolts of fabric and men, comparing the price of grain, children running in the gaps between adults' legs. There was a fiddle player outside the general store, and Eleanor stopped to listen. She had not heard music in weeks, and it reached something in her that had been quiet for too long. The man playing was old and weather-beaten, and played with the absolute unself-consciousness of someone who has long since stopped performing for an audience and is playing entirely for himself. And the tune he played was a reel that bounced and spun in the summer air with an irresistible energy. She became aware, without quite knowing when it happened, that Colt was standing beside her. Not close enough to be improper, just beside her, watching the fiddle player with the same quality of attention she was applying to him. "Do you dance?" she asked without thinking. He looked at her sideways. The corner of his mouth moved. "Not well," he said. "Neither do I," she said. "I mean to say I have been taught properly, but it never felt like the point." "What is the point?" he asked. She considered the fiddle player, the tune spinning itself out into the warm August air, the way her feet wanted to move in spite of her standing still. "The feeling of it," she said, "not the steps." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, and something in the way he said it made her think he was agreeing to more than the question. Dorothea appeared beside them with a basket of things she had acquired from the market stalls, and the thoroughly satisfied expression of a woman who has accomplished several things at once. She looked at Eleanor, and then at Colt, and then at Eleanor again, with the carefully neutral expression of a woman who is thinking something specific and choosing not to say it. "Are you ready?" she asked. "Almost," Eleanor said, and she stood for another minute listening to the reel before she turned and followed Dorothea to the wagon. Colt loaded their purchases into the wagon bed and untied the horses and drove them back out of town, with a steadiness that Eleanor found she had come to rely on without noticing it, the way a person relies on steady weather without thinking about it until the weather changes. September came, and with it a shift in the quality of the light, and a new crispness in the morning air that made Eleanor understand for the first time why people spoke of fall on the prairie as something different from fall anywhere else. The cattle drives were winding down for the season, and Caldwell grew quieter, the temporary population of drovers moving back south, and the town settling into its more permanent self. Gerald had finished the survey work he had been conducting for the railroad and was home more often, and Eleanor saw Colt and Gerald together enough to understand what the 2 years of working for this family had meant. Gerald treated Colt with the uncomplicated respect of a man who recognizes genuine competence and reliability, and Colt worked for him with a care that went beyond what simple employment required. She asked Dorothea about it one evening when they were putting up the last of the kitchen garden's yield, filling jars with the precise and satisfying industry of preservation. "Colt seems very committed to this place," she said, keeping her voice neutral, which she knew was not entirely neutral. Dorothea continued working with the composure of a woman who has been expecting this question for some time. "He is," she said. "Gerald offered him a full partnership last spring, a share of the land, not just wages. Colt has not given him an answer yet." "Why not?" Eleanor asked. "I could not say with certainty," Dorothea said, which Eleanor did not entirely believe, but she did not push further because she was not sure she was ready for wherever pushing would take her. The answer came to her indirectly, as important answers often do, through a conversation that was not about the question at all. She and Colt had ridden out to the far edge of the property one afternoon in mid-September, Eleanor on Agnes and Colt on the bay, to check the condition of the fence line along the south pasture. It was the kind of task that required movement but not much speech, and they had been riding in comfortable quiet for the better part of an hour when they stopped at a high point of ground that gave a view across the whole sweep of the Pruitt land and the rolling plain beyond. Eleanor looked out at it. The sky was the particular September blue that she had decided was specific to Kansas, a blue so deep and clear it seemed to have texture, and the grass had turned to gold in the cooler air, and the creek line wound through it like something deliberate. She thought, "I will miss this." The thought arrived with a force she had not expected, followed immediately by a second thought that arrived with even greater force. "I will miss this because leaving means leaving all of it, which includes him." She sat very still on Agnes and let both thoughts settle. Colt was looking at the view with that quality of attention he applied to the landscape, an attention she had come to recognize as love, though she knew he would not have used the word. He had grown up on a piece of Texas earth that had been taken from him, and he had spent 12 years moving and not settling, and she understood now, seeing him looking out at this particular stretch of Kansas with that particular expression, that he had been here long enough for something to take root. And she understood something else too, which was that a man who had lost one home was likely to be careful about the next one. Careful in ways that might look like hesitation to someone watching from the outside. "Gerald told Dorothea he offered you a partnership," she said, and immediately wished she had found a less direct approach, but there it was. Colt turned to look at her. His expression was not startled exactly, but it was attentive in a new way. "He did," he said. "She says you have not answered him." He was quiet for a moment, looking back at the plain. "No," he said. "May I ask why?" she said. "You do not have to answer." "No," he said again. "I do not mind." He took a breath. "When I left Texas, I told myself I was going to stop putting down roots somewhere that could be taken from me. It seemed simpler. A man who does not invest in a place cannot have the place ripped away from him." "But that is not actually simpler," Eleanor said. "That is just a different kind of loss." He looked at her. The wind moved through the grass below them with a sound like water. "Yes," he said, "I have been coming to understand that." They sat on their horses on the high ground while the September afternoon began its slow lean toward evening, and neither of them said anything more. And Eleanor thought that this was the clearest conversation she had ever had with a person, while both of them were mostly silent. The night of the Caldwell Harvest Social came in the first week of October, organized by the church women, and held in the main building of the Caldwell Grange, which was a large plain room that smelled of sawdust and beeswax candles and became, once 40 people crowded into it with the fiddle player from the market day and his companion on the upright piano, something considerably warmer and more alive than it appeared from the outside. Eleanor wore the best dress she had brought from Cincinnati, a deep blue wool that she had packed expecting to feel overdressed and out of place among the plain clothing of the prairie, but which turned out to match the quality of the other women's harvest social efforts more closely than she had expected, because Kansas women had their own ideas about occasion and were not inclined to appear at a social gathering without making an effort. Dorothea wore dark red and Gerald wore his good suit, and looked simultaneously proud and uncomfortable in the way of men who consider social gatherings a duty rather than a pleasure. Colt arrived late, which she had not known to expect him at all, and she saw him from across the room in the way one sees a person one has been thinking about when they appear in a context where thinking about them is suddenly exposed, with a slight jolt of the senses that she covered by looking immediately at the refreshment table as though it had become deeply interesting. He wore a clean shirt, and his hat was off in deference to the indoor occasion, and without it she could see his face more fully than she usually did. The dark hair and the strong line of his jaw and those direct gray eyes that found her across the room immediately, which told her something about where his attention had been even before he arrived. He crossed the room to where she was standing with Dorothea, and Dorothea, with the impeccable timing of a woman who understands her role precisely, found someone absolutely vital to speak to at the opposite end of the room. "I did not know you would be here," Eleanor said. "I was not certain I would come," he said. "I am glad I did." The fiddle player started a waltz, which was not perhaps historically the most likely choice for a Kansas Grange Hall in 1878, but the fiddle player clearly had his own opinions about this, and no one was inclined to argue with him, and the floor filled with couples almost immediately. Colt looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor looked at Colt, and the waltz spun itself out around them. "You said you do not dance well," she said. "I do not," he confirmed. "I said the steps were not the point." "You did," he said. He offered his hand, and she took it, and they went out onto the floor among the other couples, and he danced the way she had expected him to dance, without particular technical skill, but with a quality of presence and attention that made the steps feel irrelevant. He held her hand as though it mattered, and led her around the floor with the same steady care he applied to every physical task, and Eleanor thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like, not the careful negotiation of courtship as business. This, the present reality of another person's actual attention. They danced twice and then stepped outside because the Grange Hall had become very warm, and they stood on the step in the cool October night with the music coming through the walls and the stars enormous above the flat Kansas plain, and Eleanor felt the cold stone in her chest finally, completely dissolve. It had been dissolving for weeks, quietly and steadily, but here in the October air with his shoulder close to hers it finished the process, and what replaced it was not exactly joy yet, but the clear warm space where joy can live. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "When I came here I was not hoping to feel anything for a very long time. I came because my father suggested it and because I was too tired to resist the suggestion. I did not expect this place to be real the way it is real. I did not expect—" She stopped. "What did you not expect?" he asked quietly. "You," she said. "I did not expect you." The word sat in the October air between them. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and careful and wanting all at once. "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his voice was a different thing than her name in anyone else's voice. She was aware of this with complete and unambiguous clarity. "Yes," she said, though he had not asked the question yet. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "I have not been good at staying. I have spent 12 years not staying, and I have told myself it was practical, and I think you understood before I did that it was fear." "I did not judge you for it," she said. "I know," he said. "That is part of why I am saying this now." He turned his hat slowly in his hands the way he always did when he was working something out. "I told Gerald I will take the partnership. I told him this morning." She looked at him. "What decided you?" Honestly, he met her eyes directly, which was his way always. "I stopped trying to plan against loss and started asking myself what I actually wanted instead." "And what do you want?" she asked, though her heart was beating considerably faster than the autumn air warranted. "To stay," he said, "here, in this place." A pause, careful and deliberate, with reason to stay. Eleanor understood precisely what he was saying and precisely what he was not yet saying, and she understood that a man who had spent 12 years protecting himself from loss was being extraordinarily brave in this moment, and she felt something rush through her chest that was warm and real, and entirely unlike anything Charles Aldridge had ever produced in her. "Then give me your hand," she said. He looked at her. "Your hand," she said again, and held out hers. He took it. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm, and he held hers the way he had held it on the dance floor, as though it mattered. They stood on the step outside the Caldwell Grange in the first week of October, 1878, with the fiddle playing inside and the Kansas stars above them and the wide plain stretching away in all directions. And it was not a dramatic declaration, or a formal courtship moment, or anything that either of them would have been able to describe precisely to someone else. It was simply two people choosing each other, quietly and with full awareness, and the choosing was as real as anything Eleanor had ever known. They went back inside and danced one more time, and Dorothea looked at them across the Grange hall with an expression of great satisfaction that she did not bother to conceal. The month that followed was unlike any month of Eleanor's life before it. She had been courted before, by Charles and by two other men before Charles, and she understood now that what she had experienced as courtship was a formal structure overlaid on a transaction, a set of rituals designed to negotiate an arrangement that had very little to do with the actual living people involved. What happened between her and Colt in October and November of 1878 was nothing like that. It was ordinary days, lived in each other's increasing company, with no performance attached to any of it. He came to the Prewitt house for supper more evenings than before, and she learned how he ate, which was quietly and with genuine appreciation, and he learned how she ate, which was enthusiastically and with specific opinions about the food. She discovered that he read, which surprised her, and that he had a small collection of books in the bunkhouse room where he slept that included a well-worn copy of Moby Dick and 3 volumes of Emerson, which delighted her because she had not expected Emerson to make it to Kansas. She brought him a copy of Middlemarch from Dorothea's small shelf of books, and he read it with the same thorough attention he applied to fences and hay crops, and came to supper a week later ready to argue about Casaubon in a way that made her laugh until her eyes watered. "He is a hollow man," Colt said, with a conviction that suggested he had thought about this considerably. "He takes Dorothea's whole existence for his own purposes and calls it a marriage." Eleanor looked at him. "You know his name is Casaubon," she said. "Her name in the book is Dorothea." He paused. "I know that. I am not confused about the characters. Aunt Dorothea found that very funny when she lent it to me." "I expect she did," he said, and that suppressed smile moved across his face again, the one she had spent months learning to watch for and never quite got tired of seeing. She also learned in this month the particular weight of what he had lost, which was present in him, the way a healed bone is present, not visible on the surface but affecting the way a person moves through the world. His father had been a man he had admired, a rancher who had built his land from nothing and who had made the particular Texas mistake of betting on a drought year breaking when it did not. The loss of the land had coincided almost exactly with the loss of the man, and Colt had been 19 years old and had taken on both griefs simultaneously and had processed them, as young men in the West in that era were expected to process such things, by working harder and moving faster and not speaking about them. Eleanor could hear the outlines of this in the few things he said about it, and she did not press for more than he offered, but she made sure that what he offered was received with full attention rather than the distracted courtesy she had seen other people extend to grief. One evening she told him something she had not told anyone, not even Dorothea. She told him that the worst part of what Charles had done was not the humiliation of being used, or even the loss of the future she had planned. The worst part was that it had made her distrust her own perception. She had been so certain that Charles loved her. She had built her understanding of reality around that certainty, and the certainty had been completely wrong, and that wrongness had shaken something fundamental about her trust in her own ability to see things clearly. "And do you trust it now?" Colt asked. They were sitting on the porch, the November air already carrying the edge of coming winter, their breath faintly visible. She thought about it honestly. "I am beginning to," she said. "Out here I have been seeing things more clearly than I have in years. I think perhaps Cincinnati was making me see what I was expected to see rather than what was actually there." "What do you see now?" he asked. "A very large sky," she said, "and a man who says exactly what he means and no more than that." He looked at her steadily for a long moment. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes." I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that you can answer me honestly, and whatever you answer will be all right. Ask, she said. What are your intentions when spring comes? He said. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, but she could hear what the plainness was covering, which was something that mattered to him very much. She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since September, when she had understood that she would miss this place and everything in it. She had been corresponding with her father, careful letters that said less than they meant, and she had received careful letters in return that said slightly more than they meant, which was her father's way. He had asked whether she was feeling herself again. She had replied that she was feeling something better than herself, which she expected he would not understand, and which it appeared he had not, based on his subsequent letter. I do not want to go back to Cincinnati, she said. It was the first time she had said it plainly, out loud, to another person. I know that is not a complete answer. I know there are a great many practical considerations. But when I try to imagine returning to that life, to that particular set of expectations and that particular way of living, I feel something that is not quite dread but is very close to it. She looked at him. And when I try to imagine leaving here, I feel something quite similar. He was quiet for a moment, processing this with the steadiness that was his most characteristic quality. Then he said, with the precise and uncomplicated directness that she had been falling in love with since August, "Then do not leave." She looked at him. "That is not entirely simple," she said. "No," he agreed. "But the uncomplicated part is that I am asking you to stay. The complicated parts can be worked through. Are you asking me to marry you?" She said, because she wanted to be sure they were talking about the same thing. "I am," he said. The November wind moved through the dry grass of the Pruitt yard, and somewhere across the dark plain, a coyote sent up its particular thin cry into the cold air. And Eleanor Voss sat on the porch steps of her aunt's house in Caldwell, Kansas, and understood with complete and unshakable clarity that she was not looking at a transaction or a performance or a careful set of calculated courtship rituals. She was looking at a man who had spent 12 years not being brave enough to stay somewhere, and who was being as brave as he knew how to be right now for her. "Yes," she said, "I am staying." He let out a breath that had apparently been held for longer than just this conversation, and he reached over and took her hand in both of his, and they sat on the porch in the November cold until Dorothea called them in for supper. And Eleanor thought that if joy had a specific physical location, it was here, precisely here, in the pressure of his hands around hers. Telling her father was the thing that had to be done, and she did not pretend otherwise. She wrote the letter that evening, and she did not soften it with the careful circumlocutions she had been using all autumn. She wrote that she had no intention of returning to Cincinnati in the spring, that she had found herself genuinely and completely happy in a way she had not been in some years, and that she had received and accepted a proposal of marriage from a man named Colt Reardon, who worked the land and who had more integrity in his daily conduct than anyone she had previously been acquainted with in Cincinnati society. She wrote that she understood this was not what her father had arranged for when he sent her west to recover herself, but that she believed recovery had occurred, only in a direction he had not anticipated. She sealed the letter and sent it with the next mail, and then she sat down and felt the particular lightness of having done a difficult, honest thing. Her father's reply came 3 weeks later, which was fast for the distance, which told her something about his state of mind. It was a longer letter than he usually wrote. It began with the several concerns she had expected: the distance from family, the hardships of frontier life, the question of what she knew about this man's character and prospects, whether she had considered this with adequate care, given that she had been in an emotionally compromised state when she arrived in Kansas. Then the letter changed register, in the way that her father's letters occasionally did when his actual feeling broke through his habitual formality. He wrote that her mother had reminded him, when he shared Eleanor's letter, that he himself had married a woman his own father had considered unsuitable, being a merchant's daughter in a family of lawyers, and that this had turned out to be the best decision he had made in his life. He wrote that he would like to meet Colt Reardon, and that he was willing to withhold his judgment until that meeting occurred. He wrote in the final paragraph that what he wanted most for her was her actual happiness, and that if she had found it in Kansas he was glad, because the alternative, which was her returning to Cincinnati to be sensible, had been breaking her mother's heart since the day she had left. Eleanor read this letter at the kitchen table while Dorothea pretended to be entirely occupied with the bread she was making. Then she folded it carefully and pressed it flat with both hands and said, "He wants to meet him." "Good," Dorothea said, punching the bread dough with the vigor of a woman who has successfully engineered an outcome she is pleased about. "I will write to your mother. They should both come in the spring. There is room." "You knew," Eleanor said. Dorothea looked at her with the steady, kind eyes of a woman who had been watching very carefully since the day her niece stepped off the stagecoach. "I hoped," she said. "There is a difference." Colt and Gerald rode into Caldwell the following Saturday, and Colt went to see the Reverend Horace Talmadge about the question of posting banns. And the Reverend Talmadge, who had watched half of Caldwell's married population come through his doors, and had opinions about which unions were built on something real, and which were built on something less reliable, received him with a warmth that expressed itself in the particular form of a long handshake, and a question about when the young lady's family would arrive. Winter came to Caldwell with the efficient brutality that the Kansas plain applies to the season, the temperature dropping fast in December and the wind coming out of the north, with a determination that made Eleanor understand for the first time why the early settlers of this place had built their houses the way they did, close to the ground and oriented away from the north wind. She had grown up with Ohio winters, which were wet and gray and persistently cold, but they were not like this. This was a cold that had the whole flat continent behind it and nothing between it and you except the walls of whatever structure you were standing in. She did not mind it. She found to her own surprise that she did not mind it at all. She minded it in the way a person minds something that is real and present, which is completely differently from how a person minds something that is a metaphor for their internal state. The cold was just cold. It required specific practical responses: good boots, heavy wool, staying close to the stove, keeping the fire banked through the night. There was something clarifying about physical discomfort that is just what it is, with no complicated interior meaning attached. Colt came to the house on the days he was not snowbound at the ranch property, and on the evenings when the road between the two places was passable they sat in the Prewitt parlor, with the stove going, and talked about the future with the practical specificity of two people who understand that the future requires actual planning. Gerald had formally extended the partnership, and the paperwork had been filed in Caldwell with the county recorder, which meant that Colt now had a legal stake in 320 acres of Kansas grassland and a share of its revenue. They discussed where on the property a house could reasonably be built come spring, because it was clear to everyone that Eleanor and Colt, once married, would need their own establishment rather than remaining indefinitely with Dorothea and Gerald. "There is a rise on the northwest section," Colt said one evening, spreading a rough sketch of the property on the parlor table. "That has a good line of sight to the south and sits high enough that the spring flooding will not reach it. The soil is good for building. I could get the frame up before the ground freezes hard if I start the foundation work now." Gerald leaned over the sketch with the interest of a man who has always preferred practical problems to social ones. "You would want to orient it so the kitchen gets the morning sun," he said. "Yes," Colt agreed. Eleanor was looking at the sketch with a feeling she could not immediately name, and then recognized as something like wonder that this was a thing being planned. A house on a rise with morning sun in the kitchen, in a place she had arrived knowing nothing about and which had become the shape of her future. "How large?" she asked. Colt looked at her steadily. "Large enough for a family," he said. "Whatever that requires." Eleanor's cheeks warmed in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. The winter continued, and they continued through it, and by January, Eleanor had been in Kansas for 6 months, and the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach with a grief so heavy she could not eat was barely recognizable in the person she had become. She was not unaware of the change because it was too thoroughgoing to be invisible even from the inside. She was stronger, physically, in the straightforward way of outdoor work and adequate food and genuine sleep. She was quieter in the sense of being less full of noise and performance, and the social anxiety of a woman who is trying to be what is expected of her. She laughed more readily and cried less frequently, and the crying she did was the ordinary human kind, in response to actual events, rather than the suppressed internal kind that had been her companion on the stagecoach. She was also, she understood, genuinely in love, which was a thing she had thought she knew about before, and which she now understood she had known nothing about whatsoever. Being in love with Colt Reardon was not the breathless, consuming obsession she had read about in novels. It was something steadier and more specific and more interesting. It was the feeling of being seen accurately by another person, and finding that being seen was not terrifying but relief. It was the feeling of his attention as a constant in her days, present when he was there and palpable even when he was not. It was the specific quality of his humor, which was dry and precise, and showed itself rarely enough that, when it appeared, it always startled her into genuine laughter. It was the way he looked at the land he had partnered with Gerald to tend, with the same mix of love and responsibility that she was beginning to feel for it herself. She told Dorothea this one January morning when they were melting snow for water, the practical winter task of women on the Kansas plain where the pump froze solid in the deep cold. "I understand now what you and Uncle Gerald are," she said. Dorothea, stirring the pot on the stove, looked at her with an expression of mild inquiry. "You are genuinely fond of each other," Eleanor said. "Not in a grand way, in a real way. I watched you for months and I could not find the performance in it anywhere." "There is no performance," Dorothea said simply. "Gerald is a good man and I know it and he knows I know it. That is all it is at the bottom of it." "I thought love was supposed to be more complicated than that," Eleanor said. "That is what novels teach," Dorothea said, "and some of it is true, but the deep-down part is very simple. Does this person see you as you actually are? Do you see them? Can you live in the same space day after day and still be glad of each other?" She looked at Eleanor with those steady, kind eyes. "What is your answer to those questions when you ask them about Colt?" "Yes," Eleanor said, "to all of them." "Then you have what matters," Dorothea said, and returned to stirring. Eleanor's parents arrived in late April, coming by rail to Wichita and by stagecoach the rest of the way, which her mother handled with rather more grace than Eleanor had expected from a woman who had not left Cincinnati in 4 years. Her father, Edmund Voss, stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell with the expression of a man who has prepared himself for something considerably worse than what he is finding, which in this case was a small but functioning cattle town with a reasonable main street and a church visible from where he was standing. Eleanor watched her parents arrive from beside Colt, who stood with his hat in his hands and the stillness that was his most characteristic quality, and she watched her father's eyes move from the town to her to Colt, and then back to her, with the searching attention of a man who loves his daughter and has been worried about her for a long time. She understood from his expression, nothing like what he had been worrying about. She looked, if anything, better than she had looked in years, which she could see him registering with a combination of relief and something more complicated. She stepped forward and embraced her mother, who held her for a long moment and murmured something against her hair that Eleanor could not quite hear but which contained the word good. Then she stepped back and turned to Colt. "Father," she said, "this is Colt Reardon." Colt met her father's eyes directly as he met everyone's eyes and extended his hand. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I am glad you made the journey." Edmund Voss looked at the hand, looked at the man and shook it. He was a good judge of people when he chose to be, having been a merchant all his adult life, and what he saw in Colt Reardon was something he had not entirely expected. Not the rough frontier impracticality he had been privately imagining, but a man of serious and measured character who appeared to have looked at his daughter clearly and chosen her on that basis, which was precisely what Edmund had always wanted for her, and had made the mistake of thinking Charles Aldridge represented. "The journey was not bad," Edmund said. "Your country is extraordinary." "It is," Colt agreed, and the simplicity of it, the complete absence of flattery or social performance, appeared to strike Edmund Voss favorably, because something in his posture changed. The week of her parents' visit was the most interesting week Eleanor had experienced in all her months in Kansas, which was already a high standard. Her mother took to Dorothea immediately, and spent her days in the kitchen and garden with the enthusiasm of a woman who has been maintaining a city household for 20 years and finds the practicality of frontier life refreshing rather than daunting. Her father went out with Colt and Gerald 2 of the mornings to look at the land and the cattle, and came back from both outings with the look of a man who has been doing quiet recalibration. On the third evening, after supper, her father sat with Colt in the Prewitt parlor while the women were in the kitchen, and Eleanor could hear the rise and fall of their voices, but not the specific words, which she thought was probably intentional on Dorothea's part, who kept her occupied with coffee making longer than strictly necessary. When the men came back to the kitchen for their coffee, her father's expression had settled into something that was not exactly approval, which she had not expected him to arrive at in a single conversation, but which was something better than reserve. It was genuine interest. He was looking at Colt as though he had encountered something he had not previously accounted for, and was revising his framework accordingly, which for Edmund Voss was a significant development. That night, when Colt had ridden back to his room, and her parents were in the guest bedroom and Dorothea and Gerald had retired, Eleanor sat alone in the parlor with the lamp turned low, and thought about the fact that in 3 weeks she was going to be married to Colt Reardon in the Caldwell church with the bad organ, and that the woman she had been when she boarded the stagecoach in Cincinnati would not have been able to imagine this outcome in the smallest particular. She was grateful, she realized. Not performatively grateful, not the social expression of gratitude that she had been producing at intervals for months, but the deep, specific, located kind. Grateful to Charles Aldridge, most improbably, for being exactly what he was, because if he had not been that she would never have come west, and if she had never come west she would have spent her life in Cincinnati never knowing that this was possible, this specific and undefended joy. She sat with that thought for a while, and then she went to bed and slept the dreamless sleep of someone who has finally, completely come home. The wedding took place on a Friday in early May, 1879, with the Kansas spring in full expression outside the church windows, the grass gone green again after the brown of winter, and the wildflowers erupting in the low ground near the creek in a display that Eleanor's mother declared was the most extraordinary natural event she had ever witnessed, which, given that she had grown up along the Ohio River, was saying something. The church was small and plain, and the organ was indeed in the condition Dorothea had described, but the Reverend Talmadge had a genuine gift for a ceremony that made Eleanor suspect. He had been doing it long enough to stop worrying about the performance and simply mean every word, which was exactly the quality she had come to value above all others in the people around her. She wore the deep blue wool dress because it was the best she had, and because blue had turned out to be the color of Kansas sky, and she had decided, a Kansas woman now. Her mother had pressed it with particular care the night before, and pinned a small spray of the prairie wildflowers at the neckline, and Eleanor had looked at herself in Dorothea's small mirror, and thought that she looked like a person who has arrived at a place they intended to be. Colt stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that was clearly new, and when she came through the door on her father's arm and their eyes met across the length of the plain little building, the expression on his face was the most direct and unguarded thing she had ever seen in a human face. Joy, pure and specific, directed entirely at her. She walked toward it, and when she reached him and her father placed her hand in his, and she felt the warm certainty of his grip, she understood that she had stopped looking for the cold stone in her chest some time ago, that it had been gone for months, and that what lived in its place was exactly this: the feeling of being fully present in a life that was genuinely and completely her own. The Reverend Talmage married them with the simple words and genuine feeling he applied to everything. And when it was finished, the whole small congregation, which included every person in the Caldwell community that Eleanor had come to know over the past 10 months, erupted into the kind of celebration that a close community makes when it has watched something grow from nothing and is glad of it. The Prewitt house that evening was filled with more people than it had ever held, with the good food that half a dozen of the neighboring farm women had contributed, and the fiddle player from Market Day playing beside the kitchen stove, and a great deal of noise and laughter that poured out the windows into the warm May night. Eleanor danced with her husband in the small clear space between the parlor and the kitchen, and this time she did not think about the steps or the feeling or what it was supposed to be. She simply danced with him, and his hand was warm at the small of her back, and the fiddle played and the night was full of light. Her parents stayed another week and then began the journey back to Cincinnati, her mother holding Eleanor in a long embrace on the morning they left that said everything that needed to be said without any words at all, and her father shaking Colt's hand with both of his and saying, quietly and with the directness that Eleanor now recognized as a family trait, "Take care of her." "Yes, sir," Colt said. "We will take care of each other." Edmund Voss looked at him for a moment and then nodded, and that nod carried in it all the things that a man of his generation and background would not say directly, which was that he had been wrong about what his daughter needed, and that he was glad to be wrong, and that the man standing before him had his approval, given freely and without qualification. The house on the northwest rise of the Prewitt land, which was now also the Reardon land, was completed in late June of 1879, 3 weeks ahead of the estimate Colt had given in January when he had spread the rough sketch on the parlor table. It was a frame house, modest but well built, with the morning sun coming exactly right into the kitchen, and a porch along the south side that faced out over the grassland, with the view that Eleanor had seen on the day she had understood she would miss this place when she left, the view she had never left. They moved in on a Saturday in late June, with the Kansas summer enormous around them, the sky that deep improbable blue and the grass already going gold in the heat, and General Sherman watching from the fence line, with the philosophical equanimity of a pig who has seen it all. Colt carried the carpet bag and hat box across the threshold with an expression of such concentrated seriousness that Eleanor laughed, and the laugh broke across the empty new rooms of their house like the first music in a new hall, testing the acoustics, settling into the walls, becoming part of the place. "Well," he said, setting the bags down in the center of the front room. "Well," she agreed. They stood in their empty house in the summer light and looked at each other, and she thought, this is where the story begins. Not the trouble of it, not the grief that brought me here or the careful recovery or even the falling in love, though all of those are part of it. This right here, the two of us standing in an empty house we intend to fill, this is where the story that matters begins. Are you happy?" he asked, because he was always precise about asking the things that mattered rather than assuming the answer. "Yes," she said, without hesitation, because it was completely true. "Good," he said, and the particular warmth in that word, the way it contained a whole world of feeling in a single syllable, was so absolutely him that she stepped forward and put her arms around him and pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the solid reality of him, his arms coming around her, the warm July smell of him, and she thought, this is what joy is. Not the absence of grief or the recovery from loss, but this, the specific weight and warmth of a person you love who loves you back, standing in the house you are going to build your life in. They built it. Month by month, season by season, in the way that frontier people built things, which is to say practically and incrementally, and with constant attention to what the land and the weather required. Eleanor learned to put up vegetables against the winter, and to make bread that rose properly in the altitude, and to handle a rifle, which she did not expect to need, and hoped she would not, but which Colt taught her with patient thoroughness, because the plane was the plane, and a woman alone on it deserved to be able to take care of herself. She also continued the journal she had begun in her first weeks on the Pruitt land, filling one small book, and then another with the particular quality of light at different seasons, and the behavior of the horses and the observation of the wildflowers and the things Colt said that she wanted to remember exactly. He continued to surprise her. She had known from the beginning that he was steady and competent and honest, but what continued to reveal itself over the months and years of living alongside him was the depth of his attention, the way he noticed things, the particular quality of the air before a storm, the moment when the creek was thinking about rising, the expression on a horse's face that indicated something was troubling it, the expression on Eleanor's face that indicated the same. He noticed her with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, and what she found was that being noticed that way, consistently and without agenda, was the thing that made her most fully herself. They disagreed sometimes, the way real people in a real marriage disagree, over practical things and occasionally over things that were not so practical. She had strong opinions about the garden layout, and he had strong opinions about the fence placement. And there was one memorable argument in the fall of their first year together, about whether to sell two of the horses that concluded with both of them laughing over its own seriousness, because the horses in question were Gerald's horses, and it was not actually their decision at all. But the disagreements passed the way weather passes, leaving the air clear and the landscape the same, and what remained was always the same. The fundamental orientation of two people toward each other, the choice renewed daily in small ways, the particular comfort of a person who knows you accurately and chooses you anyway. Their son was born in the spring of 1881, in the month of March, when the Kansas prairie was beginning its annual argument between winter and spring, the grass showing its first green under a sky that could not quite decide between blue and gray. They named him Thomas Edmund Reardon, Thomas for Colt's father and Edmund for Eleanor's, which was the kind of name that carried in it the whole weight of what had come before and the whole promise of what came after. Thomas was from the beginning a child of the prairie, which is to say loud and determined and thoroughly unimpressed by anything that attempted to limit him. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's capacity for language, and a combination of both their stubbornness that Dorothea, who visited often and with the proprietary pride of a woman who considers herself personally responsible for the situation that produced this child, declared would either make him great or give everyone around him a considerable challenge, and probably both. Eleanor nursed him in the mornings in the kitchen with the early sun coming exactly right across the floor as Colt had planned it, and she looked down at her son's face and thought about the stagecoach from Wichita to Caldwell, the dust on her skirts and the cold stone in her chest, and the 11 days of crying on the inside. And then she thought about the man who had caught her arm when she stumbled, and she thought, all of it led here. Every bit of it, all the grief and all the distance and all the slow recovery, led here to this morning, and this kitchen and this child and this life. She wrote to her mother that week, and described Thomas in the precise and loving detail of a woman who has discovered that she is a person who notices things. And her mother wrote back with the warm enthusiasm of a grandmother who intends to make the journey to Kansas that summer and did, arriving with Edmund and a quantity of presents that somewhat exceeded the storage capacity of the Reardon house, and holding Thomas in her arms with an expression that Eleanor recognized as the same expression she herself wore when she held him, which is to say, an expression of complete helpless love. Her father walked the Reardon property with Colt that visit, spending a long morning looking at the hay fields and the cattle operation and the partnership with Gerald. And he came back for dinner with the look of a man who has been doing a reckoning and is satisfied with the results. At dinner he told a story about the early years of his own business, the years before the shipping contracts had been established, and when it had not been certain that things would come together the way they ultimately did. And it was the most personal thing Eleanor had ever heard her father say in a public setting, and she understood it was a gift given to Colt. The admission that he had once been uncertain, that he had built from uncertain ground, that he recognized what he saw in the man across the table from him. Colt listened with full attention and received the gift with the simplicity of a man who knows its value. "I appreciate that," he said, which was all he said, and Edmund nodded once, and that was more than enough. Their daughter was born in 1883, a girl with Eleanor's coloring and Colt's absolute determination about everything, whom they named Clara after no one in particular, but simply because the name felt right on her the moment they saw her. Clara was from her earliest weeks a different creature from Thomas, quieter, more observant, with a quality of watching the world that reminded Eleanor of her husband's fundamental stillness, and which made Eleanor certain that Clara would eventually surprise everyone who underestimated her because of the quiet. Thomas was 2 years old when Clara arrived, and regarded her with the mixed suspicion and fascination of a firstborn encountering competition, and then settled, over the weeks that followed, into the role of devoted older brother with the same thoroughness he applied to everything, which was to say completely. Colt watched his children with an expression that Eleanor had never seen on his face before, which was to say an expression of pure, undefended wonder. He had been afraid of staying somewhere and losing it, and he had stayed, and he had gained things that made the old fear look like what it was, a much smaller thing than what had replaced it. Eleanor stood one evening in the summer of 1883, on the porch of the house on the northwest rise, watching Colt walk across the yard with Thomas on his shoulders and Clara in his arms, both children talking at once in the way children do when they have the complete attention of a parent they love, and she felt the full measure of everything that had accumulated since the day the stagecoach wheels had stopped in the red dust of Caldwell. Not a performance of happiness, not the social expression of satisfaction with a well-arranged life, but the real and specific and completely unglamorous joy of living exactly where you are supposed to be with exactly who you are supposed to be with. She had come west to forget a broken heart. What she had found instead was that forgetting was never the point. The point was not to erase the past, but to build so much genuine life on top of it that the past became simply the path that had brought you to the place you belonged. Colt looked up from the yard and saw her on the porch, and he smiled, the full, unheld smile she had earned slowly over months of trust and honesty, the one he gave her now with the ease of a man who has stopped protecting himself against the possibility of joy. She smiled back, and the Kansas evening light poured across the grassland gold and warm, and General Sherman observed the whole scene from the fence with immutable calm, and the house on the northwest rise held its family inside it with all the solid permanence of something built to last by a man who had finally, completely, decided to stay. Eleanor reached into the pocket of her apron and felt the small, worn journal she always carried now, full of the things she noticed and the things she wanted to remember, and she thought she would add tonight to it later, this particular moment with the light and the children's voices, and the man crossing the yard toward her with the ease of someone who knows exactly where he is going. The prairie stretched away in all directions, enormous and unhurried, exactly as it had been when she first arrived with grief in her chest and dust on her skirts, and it was the same prairie and she was a different person, and the difference was entirely the point. This was what the West had given her, not forgetting but finding, not recovery from love lost but the arrival at love real, which was nothing like what she had been taught to expect and everything she had never known to want. Colt reached the porch steps and put Thomas down, and Thomas immediately ran back into the yard with the single-minded energy of a 3-year-old who has identified something that requires investigation. And Colt came up the steps with Clara settled against his shoulder and stood beside Eleanor, and looked out at the plain in the evening light the way he had always looked at it, with the attention of a man who knows that what he loves requires seeing clearly every day, not just once. "Good evening," he said to her. "Very good," she said, and leaned against him, and his arm came around her, and they watched the sky turn and Thomas investigate whatever he was investigating, and the grassland hold its particular evening gold, and the world was exactly as it should be, fully and finally, and without reservation. Thomas came running back across the yard with his arms full of nothing in particular, which was how children carry the most important things, and Clara made the contented sound of a well-held baby, and the fiddle player was not there to play, but the wind through the grass made its own music that Eleanor had learned to hear in the years since she arrived, the low particular note of the Kansas plain in summer, which was not Cincinnati and not anywhere else she had been, but was home. Entirely and irrevocably, for as long as she wanted it, which was longer than she had any way to measure from here. She wanted it always, and always was exactly what she had.